It's the week ending Saturday the 3rd of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a chaotic presidential debate between Biden and Trump, controversy over UK students forced to isolate in their halls of residence, and the banning of plastic straws and cotton buds in England. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Joe Evans and Gabriel Power, and a new face, freelance journalist Suchandrika Chakrabarti. Welcome to the show, Suchandrika. Tell us a fun fact about yourself that we couldn't deduce on Google.
So, back around the turn of the century, I bumped into Denise Van Outen in my local nightclub Hollywood's in Romford and got her autograph on my bus ticket.
Already you're sounding very different to Holden. It's good to have you here. Joe, you are starting the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is the world's biggest carbon emitter really about to go green?
The COVID-19 epidemic has enlightened us that mankind needs self-reform to speed up the formation of a green development mode and lifestyle to build a beautiful world with ecological civilization. China will make tougher policies and take more stringent actions to achieve the peaking of carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and strive to neutralise carbon neutrality before 2060.
Chinese Premier Xi Jinping addressing the United Nations last week. Joe, what's the story?
So President Xi Jinping last week stunned the world, really, when he told the United Nations General Assembly that China would pledge to reach peak carbon before 2030 and then drive down emissions to virtually zero by 2060. It's a serious turn for the world's biggest climate polluter, and it's considered to be a massive step in tackling the climate crisis, the largest since the Paris Climate Agreement.
And he said that it was the COVID epidemic that had led him to make this pledge. I was struggling slightly to see what the link there would be. Do you think there's something else going on?
It has been suggested that the COVID link was made because it's shown how vulnerable perhaps we are on the planet and that things aren't quite as solid and stable as they might appear. But yeah, I think there is something else going on. It's been suggested by experts since that to achieve this goal would be a total inversion of China's existing energy system. It could slightly derail their economic prospects. And so there is some scepticism about whether China, as I say, is about to carry out a huge about turn when its global dominance is almost entirely based on its economic prowess.
I also just wondered, big event going on at the moment, Trump's re-election campaign. I wondered whether, as Donald Trump is peddling climate skepticism again, whether this might be seen as an attempt to bolster Biden.
It should be said that China's followed the EU in taking this massive step, which pledged to toughen its own 2030 environmental targets as well last week. So it has slightly thrown the gauntlet down to Washington in a way, because China has now essentially said to Washington, we're doing this, the European Union is doing this, are you going to follow? So you're right, at a time that Trump is throwing around climate skepticism, as we saw again in the debate on Tuesday this week, it does seem like it is a sort of aggressive move as well as a potentially good environmental one.
I mean, Suchandrika, I suppose it depends whether we can believe China's commitments to stick to this for the next 40 years. After all, their promise of one country, two systems for Hong Kong was only 30 years ago, and look what happened to that.
Yeah, it's not gone great, has it? We have to look at what kind of model the West is showing. There was a 196-page document from the Committee on Climate Change, the CCC, delivered back in June, and they have got a hugely stinging rebuke of our government, saying the ministers really have to up their game if the UK is going to avoid a significant rebound in carbon emissions because of the coronavirus crisis. So, yeah, we're not on target to hit our 2050 net zero carbon target either. And then if you look at the US, Trump winning the next election could be worrying on lots of levels, but one of them is definitely in terms of climate. So back on the 16th of September, I found a fun article, just a timeline of everything he said about climate change, but let's just keep it to a few things. As forest fires blaze in the west and a hurricane hits the south, he is questioning the science around climate change. So again, when we say to China, can you do X, Y, Z, we're not showing that we're doing it.
Yes, and that's it, Gabe, isn't it? Even with China and the EU committed to a net carbon reduction, that's still only a quarter of the world's emissions. It does leave out the US and Russia and India.
Obviously, one of the major emitters of carbon emissions is coal power, and China has more than half of that on its own. But the thing that's a bit interesting about China's pledge is the fact that it not only will require an overhaul of its current energy setup, but also its future setup. Because currently, 231 coal-burning facilities are currently under construction in China, so not even they haven't even been created yet. They've still got literally 100 gigawatts of coal power under construction and 150 gigawatts in planning stages. And Xi Jinping, at the same time as saying that he's going for this 2060 pledge, has also said that carbon emissions in China will peak by 2030. He's under the impression that obviously things will get considerably worse before they get better. And I'm not entirely sure how that fits in with how Europe sees the situation. For instance, I don't think everyone in Europe is saying, oh, it's going to be terrible for a bit, but then we'll hit our targets later on. I think China is just taking a kind of unique and odd route. And yeah, as Joe said, there is a chance that they're just attempting to distract from the problems that they're having in Hong Kong and Tibet and Xinjiang, etc.
Will this threaten China's economic standing, Joe, considering they have all those coal power plants in the works?
So analysis by Carbon Brief did suggest that the investment required to actually overhaul their infrastructure like this could actually increase their GDP by as much as 5% later in the decade. The problem that China has is that unlike Western powers, it can't really rely on soft power. Its economic power is what makes it a massive world player. As we head into the Chinese century, there is perhaps an argument this is a pitch to modernise its economy. That is possibly the case. Having said that, at the same time, China is pouring billions and billions of dollars into its new Silk Road project, the Belt and Road Initiative. And the way that it's able to control the countries that have taken part in that, predominantly smaller countries in Southeast Asia, is through being able to influence them economically. So it does seem fairly unlikely, and experts have slightly poured cold water on the excitement over this, because it does seem very unlikely that China will do anything that has the potential to derail their economic growth, even if it is brief, and even if there is the potential for a sort of 10-year advantage to modernising the economy in this way.
It's such a long time frame, isn't it, Gabe? It's a good news story, obviously, for the planet that something's coming out of China, but a lot of people now who would be holding them to account will be dead by the time the target has been set.
I get the feeling that realistically, a lot of people might actually welcome a longer time frame, because if you get a pledge from a major player like America or the EU or another major global power saying, oh, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2040, that's like even more unrealistic. I feel like the very fact that China is pledging carbon neutrality by a later date than everybody else, and yet we're still suggesting that it's unrealistic, indicates that maybe, as Suchandrika said, we are being maybe a little bit unfair, and we're placing double standards on China that we don't put on other countries.
And I wonder, Suchandrika, whether there's actually going to be something of a competition now to be the home of eco-tech. There's a lot of entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley who clearly see themselves that way, but then you've got the likes of Saudi Arabia, even, with all their reliance on oil, saying they want to try and invest in environmentally friendly stuff, and now China could just blow them both out of the water.
There's definitely an image thing here, isn't there? Which can be the most eco-friendly country. And you think that's going to really help their business and that's going to really help their economy. Are they really actually trying to change? Because oil lobbies still remain extremely powerful. It will take years to dismantle their coal power. Are they just trying to do it for the image? Are they just trying to make us feel like, oh, they're doing the same thing as us, we're trying really hard on this together? Or are they really changing? It feels to me more of it's managing their image.
I suppose the next thing might be a smartphone that doesn't use batteries that are harmful to the planet, Joe, in some way, and China want to make sure that they manufacture that one just like they manufacture the iPhone.
There is an argument that China committing to more renewable energy will lead to a sort of bonanza in the sector, and that it will further cost-cutting in renewable energy and battery technology and all the things that will be helpful in terms of China modernising its economy. What we discussed with John last week about investment bubbles, that if you get China investing huge amounts of money into renewable energy sources, it will be an almighty investment bubble. Having said that, I think it is right that we should focus on the image element of this. And it's not without precedent that China does things seemingly to improve its image that then turn out not to be true in the future. In 2001, it joined the World Trade Organization, and it was widely expected that was going to transform China into a market economy and that democracy would follow. And the opposite happened, if anything. The joining the World Trade Organization allowed China to entrench its economic power and allowed the Chinese Communist Party to entrench its political power. So there is precedent for the idea that China has done things in the past and we've expected it to play out in a way that is going to be progressive or positive on the world stage, and it's actually turned out to do completely the opposite.
Okay, so what is this actually going to do to help the planet, Suchandrika? If China do this, what will that do to the global heating forecasts ahead of us?
According to the Climate Action Tracker Research Consortium, they've calculated that if China succeeds, its ambitions would effectively shave 0.2 to 0.3 degrees Celsius from global heating forecasts for 2100. So it's quite a long way off. And instead of heating up to 2.5 degrees C, the world will heat to 2.4 degrees C, above pre-industrialised levels. So this is still well above the 1.5 degrees C heating limit that the Paris 2015 signatories had hoped to achieve.
I mean, that's it, isn't it, Gabe? Even if everyone did what they said they were going to do in 2015 and that already hasn't happened, it's still not enough.
Yeah, similar studies reported that the Belt and Road Initiative alone, if completed to its maximum extent, would drive up global warming past 2 degrees just single-handedly. Another thing that a lot of experts are saying about China is that if they are to make this 2060 deadline, they would need to have a pretty significant switch to renewable energy sources, including nuclear. And after the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power disaster in Japan, after the earthquake there, China imposed lots of regulations on nuclear power plants that make them very expensive to make. It's unlikely that they would do anything that would greatly derail their economic kind of track record at the moment. But at the same time, they've set themselves up for this to be a very expensive venture.
Yeah, fascinating. So repercussions for all of us, Joe. It could be that other countries accelerate their targets, but actually it could be, as Gabriel suggests, we just get a lot more nuclear power.
Yeah, it very much could be the case. And as Gabe rightly points out, if nuclear power is the way that China decides to make its economy slightly more renewable, it's going to be a hugely expensive process for them. It's very difficult to tell how this will play out, to be honest, and it's very difficult to tell how China's economy will play out over the period of time in which they've said they're going to reduce their reliance on carbon. There are voices in the West that are calling for liberal democracies to disengage from China. There's people calling for sort of Magnitsky-style sanctions, as we've applied against Russian businessmen, which we could see applied against Chinese Communist Party businessmen. On the other hand, there are people arguing that we're way past the point of disengaging from China and that its economic might is just completely insurmountable and that American companies will have to continue to deal with them, European countries will have to continue dealing with them. So there are ways in which their economy could be derailed, which are completely unlinked to renewable energy. There are ways in which their economy could continue to grow as it has done over the past 50 years, which will mean that perhaps we'll see a little bit more of a focus on this attempt to move towards more renewable energy sources.
Gabriel, you're up next after this. Okay, Gabriel, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Are NGOs' stars fading fast?
What really happened was that on the 10th of this month, our bank accounts were frozen. We were given no prior information, prior or post information for that matter. We got to know only when we approached our banks for some payments that our accounts have been frozen. And it's been 2 years since this incessant wave of harassment has been going on, and the government hasn't even filed a charge sheet against us.
Yamini Mishra from Amnesty International speaking to ABC News Australia. Gabriel, what's she referring to?
As many people may have seen this week, human rights group Amnesty International made the rather surprising announcement that they will be suspending their operations in India in response to what they call a witch hunt by the Indian government, which they claim froze their bank accounts in the country on Tuesday. Amnesty claims that it has faced an onslaught of attacks, bullying and harassment by the government in India that they claim is a direct response to the human rights work that it's doing. And India has hit back saying that it's all lies, basically.
The charge from the Indian government is that Amnesty in India accept money from foreign countries to fund their domestic campaigns in India, and that's illegal in India. Amnesty say they don't. Do you know if the government's actually produced any evidence to say that they do?
It certainly hasn't been reported in the press, and Amnesty has denied that the Indian government has any claims against them. But while the kind of he said, she said aspects of the situation are pretty well-trodden ground, I think this whole scenario gives us a chance to dive deeper into the role of NGOs like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and their increasingly fraught relationships with more populist national governments around the world.
Suchandrika, the whole kind of value of Amnesty, I suppose, is putting pressure on governments that can be shamed. If Modi's basically saying, stop painting me in a bad light, I'm going to respond by doing something that puts me in a bad light, it's quite difficult to really have an argument against that.
Yeah, exactly. It depends on what Modi sees as a bad light. So he came in with this idea of changing India for the better. He calls it a Naya Bharat, which is a new India. And that's not completely different to somebody in America who puts something on a baseball caps. Basically, one of his trademark policies is to change the citizenship law and discriminate against Muslims, which is their huge population within the country. And that's the way he's going. Is Amnesty leaving his country like that big a deal when he's prepared to treat some of his citizens like that? I'm not sure. He had an aim of putting India on the map by whichever way he felt like doing that. And this is the way he's going about it. So possibly this is just a drop in the water for him.
It may not matter to him domestically as a populist, Joe, but it does matter as we're reflecting here. It matters in the West, doesn't it? It matters in liberal democracies. People notice. If Amnesty are forced out of your country, that's not a good look.
No, it's not a good look. But then if you look, as has been noted, to where Modi has turned for his friends in the West, it is the gentleman in the White House that's fighting for re-election. And one of the concerns about the tensions between India and China on their Himalayan border is that America could be dragged into that conflict because they are funding India to the tune of millions of dollars worth of military equipment. And so if that's where your friends lie, if that's where your Western allies lie, then the sort of India first approach probably isn't really going to bother you. And I can't imagine that Modi is sat around worrying about the optics of kicking Amnesty International out of a country when he can open the front page of an American newspaper on any given day and see that Trump doesn't worry about the optics of tear-gassing American citizens, for example, which is arguably an even more obvious and egregious thing for a political leader to do than to expel an NGO over what we've already said is it's a fairly disputed allegation.
If Suchandrika, the money in Amnesty International India did come from domestic Indian citizens, as they claim, then was it money well spent? Have they been effective in making a difference in India? What have they been campaigning on?
I think one thing that's worth talking about is women's rights, which is obviously a huge issue in India. And something that we've seen happen during Modi's premiership is that the kind of sterilisation programme is happening again. And it was something that started during the emergency in the 70s, which Indira Gandhi as Prime Minister put in place. So basically we have 6 months after Modi comes in late 2014, we have a government-sponsored mass sterilisation programme where 10 women die and more are left critically ill after undergoing certain procedures at a clinic in a rural state of Chhattisgarh in central India. So basically they pay poor and vulnerable women $23 to give up their fertility, and usually they've never accessed any other kind of contraception before that's happened. That will remind you of what's been happening with ICE and vulnerable women on the border in the US. We had a whistleblower tell us about these hysterectomies that they didn't know about a couple of weeks ago. And basically Amnesty has spent a lot of time campaigning for women's rights in that way. But how far they've actually managed to get in there and change things is very debatable. It's clearly a hugely entrenched problem.
Gabe, was that, do you think, the issue that ultimately attracted Modi's ire, or do you think it was the allegations of war crimes against Pakistan, which Amnesty were also pursuing?
So Modi's relationship with Amnesty is an intriguing one because we can compare it to Trump. Obviously, there are huge parallels there, but it's interesting because I feel like Trump treats NGOs, the World Health Organization, as a sort of, oh, they don't know what they're talking about, let's ignore them, blah, blah, blah. Whereas Modi appears to have actually gone out to harass Amnesty, if Amnesty are to be believed. And that is interesting because it coincides with a sort of lack of productivity in what Amnesty's trying to do. Like, their trophy case is really impressive. In the past, they campaigned for the International Criminal Court, which was adopted by the UN in 1998. They campaigned for arms trade treaties, which were signed, and the ban on landmines. But in recent years, I feel like they're going to frequently be a kind of nuisance for populist leaders because they are, in a way, almost a glorified news source. They don't really make a huge amount of difference anymore. And like, one of the two things that a lot of news outlets have noted that Amnesty did before they were sanctioned by India's government was release 2 reports, one about violence in Jammu and Kashmir and one about police violence in Delhi. If that's as far as they're going, then you can understand why a populist, right-wing, fairly nationalist leader would want to get rid of that entirely, rather than an organization that's affecting like great change around the world.
I think it is interesting in the sense that actually lots of populist nationalist leaders don't mind NGOs like Amnesty operating in their country because in many ways they fill the void that social services are meant to fill. And so you can avoid having to provide basic social services because international NGOs fill the gap without people shouting bingo, like when John mentions the 2008 financial crash. Having spent some time living in Southeast Asia, it's a thing that you know,
there we go.
It's going to happen. You quite commonly see,
one formative experience of Joe's life.
It's a thing you quite often see, that NGOs fill the void where schooling doesn't exist properly, or where healthcare doesn't exist properly, or where access to even to like psychological care doesn't exist properly. lots of dictators can avoid having to provide those services because they're filled by NGOs, and you end up with this sort of weird NGO economy that exists to fill a gaping hole that most tax dollars in the West are spent on. So I don't think I would necessarily be taking cues from this, because in many ways it will produce a problem for Modi in that he'll have to fill all those social services that organisations like Amnesty fill. Having said that, if you're a populist nationalist leader who is frankly totally unconcerned by the idea of bad press, then there isn't really any downside. The worst thing that can happen is that people tell Modi that he's a populist nationalist leader with no regard for the rule of law, in which case I think he'd probably shrug and say, oh, so you've read my latest manifesto. That's fine.
If you'd like to hear more about Amnesty, actually, there's a new podcast series that Amnesty have made called Witness, which I've been told to plug by my producer. So there you go. Witness by Amnesty International. Go and check that out. Okay, so Suchandrika, you're up next after this. So Suchandrika, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Oh, it's Birmingham's loss, but it's the internet's gain.
If Parliament were a reality TV show, then the whole lot of us, I'm afraid, would have been voted out of the jungle by now. But at least we'd have had the consolation of watching the Speaker being forced to eat a kangaroo testicle.
Oh, wow, what a different world we are in now. Boris Johnson's speech at the Conservative Party conference last year. Suchandrika, it's going to be very different this year.
Yes, so just like what's happening with live comedy, unfortunately Boris Johnson won't have an audience this time. The Tories cancelled their Birmingham conference back in the summer, but unlike Labour and the Lib Dems who had to do the same, they said we're going to go online, and there's still going to be some level of party conference. Won't be drinking and chatting in hallways, but we'll get something done. They've just released some pictures and some info this week. The virtual platform was built by a top tech firm that they won't reveal until after the event for security reasons. But basically, you can buy a virtual stall for between £6,000 and £25,500 plus VAT, which is about the same as usual, if not a bit more. And you can buy tickets, so they remain pretty steep, £850 as a business guest, £100 as a general guest. And you can attend as something called an observer. I'm not entirely sure what that is. I think it's free. I might have to click on it and just find out.
And it looks like what? Describe these pictures for us, because it isn't like a 2D experience, is it?
They do look three-dimensional, these little tents with the Conservative tree logo on the front. It makes me think of The Sims. There's a really Sims extension pack vibe here. There's a little foyer bit, so you can walk around and there's screens within the foyer to get their messages out. I don't know what it would look like to speak to each other. The chairs and tables seem quite realistic.
Okay, so what you're basically saying is the Tory party conference has become a computer game. Why has that happened?
Number one, they're going to still get the press for it, aren't they? But much more importantly, they're going to still get the money. The party political conferences are generally quite a money spinner, especially for the Tories. They charge people, obviously, loads to come along and to have these stalls. They usually get between 1.2 and £2 million revenue from these party conferences.
But the whole point of that is influence, isn't it? Particularly when they're the party in power, apart from meeting fellow delegates and Conservatives. The point is that you are sitting, 3 seats away from Jeremy Hunt, and you might be able to have a conversation with him. This isn't going to be the same, is it, as the real experience? So why do you think they're bothering to innovate? Why not just do a Zoom call?
With a Zoom call, you don't have the experience of entering a new space and being part of something else. With a Zoom call, we have all the problems of having delays, waiting to speak, sitting in a gallery that doesn't look sort of very real, and we have Zoom fatigue.
Gabriel, have you heard of that? Zoom fatigue? Is it something you'd be bearing in mind if you were designing a conference?
Well, it's something that I've experienced myself. One of the major problems with Zoom, or with everything, because on the Conservative Party website, I should just say, they also ask the rhetorical questions, fancy a FaceTime with Boris or a Zoom call with Rishi? So it appears that they're multi-platforming. But either way, all of these sorts of virtual video conferencing softwares, they all remove certain nuances in human communication that are vital for a healthy conversation. Certain social cues like facial expressions and certain bits of speech that you'd normally be able to pick up on if you were there in person.
And also silences are something that amongst good friends can be comfortable. And it seems to me And interactive conversations online just never are. You feel like something's gone wrong.
Absolutely. That obviously is exacerbated by the fact that you rely on the speed of your internet in order to reduce lag and reduce buffering. And those sorts of things will just extend the agony in a certain way. And it also leads to a lot of talking over each other, which is something that obviously you'd hopefully not do that much in person either.
So this podcast is about repercussions for all of us, Joe. Do you think that beyond party conference season, we could see repercussions from this in that when people are designing an online event, which is the world we're heading into now in 2021, they're going to try and turn to their own bespoke platform? They're not just going to use what's available off the shelf.
I can't see it personally. I can't see the Conservative Party Sims extension pack becoming the new sort of measure of a good event. I can only imagine, I've attended the Conservative Party conference before, not as a delegate, I should say. I can only imagine that their hope is that the sort of young Tories who think that because they have a Conservative Party membership, they're part of the cabinet somehow, will still pay ludicrous amounts of money to go to this event. To be quite honest, I think that like the emergence of a coronavirus vaccine at some point will probably put pay to the idea that we're going to start holding events where you click through your computer screen and wander around. And as Gabe has just mentioned, there is huge issues with just the fatigue of having to communicate via, video calls and video chats. And so I can't imagine that this is going to hugely catch on. And I also agree that for politicians specifically, I don't think it's a hugely preferable thing. As was mentioned right at the beginning, silence is a problem on Zoom, and I think silence will be a real problem for Boris Johnson. He's a man who likes an audience. He's the man that waved a frozen fish around during the leadership campaign, and he thrives off that kind of communication.
And a lot of those people that were in the audience, Suchandrika, when he was doing that stuff were elderly, not to put too fine a point on it. Delegates at the Tory party conference, this goes for the Lib Dems and for Labour as well, but nonetheless, a lot of those delegates are going to find this technology too baffling to join in, aren't they? Wouldn't they have been better sticking with something that everyone has now got their heads around?
Possibly you're also suggesting that the elderly delegates are cool with Zoom. But if they're trying to go for the younger vote, which I think they need to do as a party, then there's also this element of performance that creeps in, and it's something that Boris Johnson likes to do, perform for an audience, although he won't necessarily get the same kind of feedback from an audience. But do all the rest of his cabinet have the same sort of performance skills? Do we see Rishi performing like that, Priti Patel? Do we see Matt Hancock performing that well in a virtual stage, in a virtual space where you can't hear back from people? I'm not sure his cabinet will really stand up to that level of performance that he can do, and they might not come across as well as they could otherwise.
That's one of the things that I find difficult about using video conferencing technology is the element of performance that's just different to a normal conversation. I've done it now. I always turn off my own video camera so I'm not looking at myself, so you guys can see me but I can't see myself, because just, I don't know if my ego is uniquely all-encompassing, but if I see myself in the corner talking, I find myself looking at myself rather than focusing on what I'm actually saying. And Gabriel, do you think eventually people will build up the techniques to combat that kind of self-flagellation, or do you think actually we've had so many centuries of evolution to get to the stage where we're used to talking face-to-face that video conferencing is never going to feel entirely natural for anybody?
It's hard to say, really. I feel like I've adjusted a little bit to it. I do exactly what you're talking about, in that, like, right now we're on a video call and I am unfortunately looking at myself while I talk. Just, I'm not entirely sure why, but it's just the kind
Your hair looks lovely. Don't worry about it. And you've got some lovely blue headphones today too.
And so, yeah, that's a kind of like weird habit that I have, that a lot of other people have probably too. There's a sort of fascination that people have with how they look when they talk.
I think that it's interesting that we talk about the loss of nuance, which I don't think is necessarily something that Johnson will struggle with, because he is obviously sort of famed for his ability as a communicator, but I don't think anybody would describe him as a nuanced one. And I think actually it was interesting, if you compare Ed Davey, the new Lib Dem leader's conference speech, which was obviously virtual, with Keir Starmer's conference speech, which was also delivered to a camera in an empty room. It's striking that Starmer's has been noted by a few political commentators to have felt quite a lot more natural than Ed Davey's, which is possibly because Keir Starmer's a barrister, so he spent quite a lot of his life addressing a room in almost total silence, and that he's maybe slightly more comfortable with that kind of, you don't crack jokes or wave frozen fish around in the High Court, and perhaps that's sort of prepared him quite well for the Zoom era in which you don't get that kind of instant feedback.
But I saw that speech, Suchandrika, on the news, Keir Starmer's speech, and I suppose I got out of it what the Labour Party wanted me to get out of it as a viewer at the news at 10. I saw their new slogan, I saw their new leader. It did seem a bit sad and desolate. It didn't seem like it was something that actually was really worth reaching me, in the sense that I don't care about their political strategy at the moment. Everyone cares about the virus and what's going on with that. And if you want to really talk to your own delegates and your own crowdfunders, is the sort of classic political conference and the speech and everything, is that the right thing to do this year at all?
I suppose you still have the fact that it gets column inches, it still gets that press, we're still talking about it. So if the Tories are just cancelled completely, they would have this void of news and we might just be concentrating.
They got a daily press conference. We all know who the Prime Minister is.
Well, we would be concentrating on how he's handling the coronavirus rather than thinking about how he handles an audience or a crowd. So maybe this is a really nice distraction to have. And the fact they're spending money on it makes it an interesting new experience that, again, like we quite like to know what it'd be like to walk through his virtual corridors and go to those virtual stalls and see a virtual Jeremy Hunt again. So that I think for them it's worked. It's moved away from the fact that they're not handling this moment in time all that well. And Keir Starmer stands up in PMQs and tells them off for it very well. So they're going to throw a party instead and say, hey, look at us, shiny things, money. And I think the delegates might go for that.
Gabe, you're nodding.
Yeah, I was going to add, I think that's exactly right. I think the fact that if you search Tory Party virtual conference or Tory Party conference in general on Google, all the results you get are about the logistics of this bizarre virtual monstrosity that they've created rather than of the substance of whatever Johnson is going to talk about. It may not have been designed as a distraction, but it appears to just be one anyway.
That is the key difference, isn't it, between a conference speech and a daily press conference? It's all well and good saying he has a daily press conference, but midway through his conference speech, Chris Whitty isn't going to interrupt him and tell the country how many people have died that day. And I think that is exactly why he'll want to do a conference speech, to try and nullify the memory of those daily press conferences, which I don't think he's enjoyed hosting at all.
All right, virtual standing ovations all round. That is it for this edition of The Week Unwrapped. A big thank you to Suchandrika, Joe and Gabe for a truly non-fatiguing Zoom call. Reviving, I'd say this was. If you're looking for an online experience to help you feel informed, just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, the host has ended the meeting. Log off.